Hey guys, and welcome to Not So Bible Scholar. My name is Corey. If you haven't had a chance, you might want to go back and watch the introduction or welcome video just to kind of get an idea of what this project is all about. But today is episode 1, and we are going to start a new series that I've been working on recently, so it's fresh. And I'm going to call this series Paul's Jewish Background, right? And there'll be a number of episodes, probably anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes long. Just discussing different aspects of Paul's Jewish background. So, first episode today is Reading Paul is a Jew, and it's really the foundation of the episodes moving forward. It kind of sets up the conversation and kind of gives you an idea of what we're going to be talking about. So, we're going to be looking at a question today that might seem kind of arbitrary to some, but I think it's an important question to ask because it kind of really gauges it gauges our thought process for when we approach Paul's letters, right? Where we're at and how we're thinking about Paul. So it's important. And the question is this: if I was to approach Paul later on in his life, probably 50s AD, Paul died probably mid 60s AD, so later on in his life when he's a little more mature. If I was to approach Paul at about that time and I asked him, Paul, would you consider yourself to be a Jew, or would you consider yourself to be a Christian? Right? And again, it might seem like an arbitrary question, but let's go ahead and break this apart and look at it here. So let's just start with the simple one. Paul, would you consider yourself to be a Jew? Right? I think Paul would emphatically have said yes, absolutely. Even later on in his life, this would have been after he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. He would have said yes, absolutely, and he actually says so in his letters. So let's take a look here at Galatians 2:13. Galatians 2:15. We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is justified not by the works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So, but the first 5 or 6 words here are the most important. He says, we ourselves are Jews by birth, right? And so the we here is actually Paul, and he's talking to Peter. This little segment here connects with the segment above. This is where Paul has his falling out with Peter in Antioch. And he probably also includes the rival Gentile teachers that he's kind of, I'm going to say, shaming in the book of Galatians, but he says, we ourselves are Jews by birth. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. He includes himself in that, right? So let's just look at another one real quick. Philippians 3, right? So if anyone else has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law a Pharisee, as to zeal a persecutor of the church, right? So this is perfect tense, so this would have a present implication. So he's saying, I was circumcised on the 8th day, I am a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law a Pharisee, as to the zeal a persecutor of the church. And so I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Paul would say, yes, absolutely. I am a Jew. I am a Jew by birth. I am a Hebrew, born of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, a member of the people of Israel. I think that one's kind of easy to see, but the next one, as we break this apart, it's not so easy, and this is where it gets kind of interesting, right? So we're going to look at Acts 11. We're going to read a few verses here. And so if I was to go up to Paul and ask, Paul, would you consider yourself to be a Christian? What would he say? Well, after doing some reading and some researching, I would say, again, emphatically yes, but with a small caveat here. So whenever we start talking about Judaism, Jew, Christian, Christianity, we really need to be careful how we're defining these terms, right? So let's look at the word Christian in the New Testament. And it actually only shows up 3 times, twice in the book of Acts, once in 1 Peter. So we're going to look at Acts 11 here, starting in verse 23. When he came and saw the grace of God, he rejoiced, and he exhorted them all to remain faithful to the Lord with steadfast devotion. For he was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, and a great many people were brought to the land. Then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, which would be Paul. And when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. So it was that for an entire year they met with the church and taught a great many people. And it was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. You can see there's quotes there on Christians. So this term in Greek is Christianos, right? So if we go back to the Old Testament, to the Septuagint, and we notice that the Hebrew word Mashiach 45 times is translated into Greek in the Septuagint as Christos, right? Which would be the root word of Christianos, or Christians here, right? And the word Mashiach means anointed one, right? So it has this association with authority, maybe a king or a priest, you know? And a lot of times in English, the word is rendered Messiah. Sometimes it's rendered anointed one, right? So we have this idea of a Messiah. So Christianos, then, with this idea of an authority figure or a Messiah, is an association or a label for people who are followers of the Messiah, who would have been followers of Jesus at this time, right? And so a little bit of backstory. We're in Antioch here, right? There would be a lot of different gods. There would have been quite a few shrines. Artemis would have been a big one, right? And so basically what's happening here, there are also Jewish synagogues in Tarsus at this time, or Antioch, I'm sorry. And so what would have happened is the Romans, or we'll call them the Gentiles, all right, needed a way to kind of segregate between the synagogue people, which would have been kind of like the non-messianic, and then these Messiah people, right? And so that's where the term Christianus comes into play. Now, if you really think about this, what's the real question that we're asking is, would the label Christian in 1st century AD, would that have been the same as the way we use it in the 21st century, right? And I don't quite think so. When we think of the term Christian or Christianity, we think of it as like a religious system that's segregated, or it's separate from Judaism or Jews, right? These are two different things, and they're kind of two religious systems that don't really interconnect, right? So today you really couldn't be a Jew and a Christian at the same time, because they are two separate religious systems. But in the 1st century, right, the term Christianus would have been associated with this Messiah figure, and a Messiah figure is a very Jewish thought. It's a very Jewish idea. You know, you see it in the Old Testament and in other Jewish literature, small echoes of kind of this messianic hope for Israel. And it's this figure that's going to come and liberate God's people out of its bondage to foreign powers. And in this instance, it would be the Roman Empire. And, you know, this is really big. N.T. Wright makes he makes a big deal about the Exodus, right? And them being in slavery, and the idea of redemption is a freedom from that slavery. You know, that's a big thing to N.T. Wright and a lot of his work. Pamela Eisenbaum has a book. It's Paul Was Not a Christian. It's kind of an interesting title to the book, but it is an amazing book. If you have a chance, you should get it and read it. But, you know, she makes the claim that, you know, at this time, the Christian movement would have been a Jewish movement, right? It would have been a very Jewish idea. And she even makes the claim that if, for whatever reason, one of Paul's letters got lost on the side of the road and a Roman soldier was to pick it up and look at it, he would automatically tell this was written by a Jew. He wouldn't necessarily have said this was written by a Christian. It was written by a Jew. And if another Jew, a synagogue Jew, would have picked up this letter and read it, he would have recognized this was written by another Jew, and they would have differed on their beliefs, but he wouldn't have called him, a Christian or a heretic, So it is a very Jewish idea, the idea of a Messiah rescuing Israel. So, and you even see this later on. So about AD 132, there's a rabbi named Rabbi Akiba. He thought a man named Bar Kokhba was the long-awaited Messiah, and he was going to liberate and free the people from their slavery from all these foreign powers and the empire that was over them, and actually started a rebellion. Well, he died. Bar Kokhba died, and Rabbi Akiba says, "Oops, he must not have been the Messiah," because the idea of a suffering, dying Messiah, that was kind of unheard of at about this time. So, was the term Christian in the first century, was it separate from, we'll call it Judaism, right? And after looking at terms, James D.G. Dunn has a commentary on Acts, and he makes the claim that, it's a very Jewish idea. Jesus was actually the Jewish Messiah. Paul makes that claim. And so it's that Jesus is kind of the continuation of Israel and of Israel's story, or what we would consider the Old Testament. And Jesus is fulfilling those promises within the Old Testament. That's the claim that Paul makes in Galatians. So just to kind of wrap everything up or kind of summarize, would Paul have considered himself a Jew? I think absolutely. Would Paul have considered himself a Christian? I think emphatically yes, he would have, if we define the terms correctly. He probably would not have considered himself a quote-unquote Christian if we are using the definition that the way that we use it today, that it's separate and it's a separate religious system, right? So what exactly does this mean? Or how can we apply this, when we're reading Paul's letters? Well, I think if we really want to appreciate Paul's letters, we need to really appreciate Paul's upbringing. Paul was a Pharisee. He would have learned the scriptures and basically been soaked in the scriptures since he was a little boy. More than likely, he would have studied in Jerusalem with Pharisees. And I believe in Acts, I can't think of it off the top of my head, it says that he actually studied under a pretty famous Pharisee at the time. So we need to appreciate that Paul was a Jew. He's writing as a Jew even after his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. And if we want to really understand what Paul is saying, we have to understand what Paul thinks about the entire story of Israel, which would be his Jewish heritage, right? The claims that he makes about Jesus comes from how he grew up and the hope that somebody would come and rescue God's people, right? And it would be a Messiah figure. And Paul's claiming that Jesus is that Messiah figure. So the future episodes, we're going to be looking at some of these core beliefs in first century Judaism. That'll kind of help us navigate some of Paul's letters and kind of really get us thinking about what Paul's actually saying and being able to appreciate what he's actually saying about Jesus. I think it opens up a lot of new doors for us whenever we are reading his letters. And I think it's important. So the first core belief we're going to look at next week, episode 2, is going to be that God chose Israel to be his people. So, and this is another really important core belief for Paul, and it shows up in his letters over and over and over again. So, yeah, we're going to start next week, episode 2, and I hope to see you guys then. I'm looking forward to maybe starting some conversations with you guys. So, have a great day.